Hi, we are discussing about ratios, the 17 formulas that you must know if you're writing your CBSE or your ISC paper. Okay, ratios would cover a chunk of your section B, and it is very easy to score marks if you know these formulas. It is just a formula based chapter. 17 formulas should be on your fingertips. The first one is your current ratio. Okay, what is current ratio? When I talk about current ratio, it is current assets over current liabilities. It measures your short term solvency position of the company, short term solvency or short term liquidity of the company, and your ideal current ratio is 2 is to 1. Now, when I am talking about current ratio, you should be able to trace what is current assets and what is current liabilities. Do you know what is current assets?
Yeah.
Tell me.
This thing closing inventory, trade receivables, cash in hand, cash at bank, and other receivables.
Very good. And your current liabilities?
No.
Your current liabilities would be your trade payables, bank overdraft, and other
Hmm.
payables. So when you equate your current assets over current liabilities, what you will get is your current ratio. Okay. And the answer would be written in the form of 2 is to 1 or 1.47 is to 1 or whatever you get. Ideal current ratio is 2 is to 1. Now I'm talking about quick ratio. Second ratio. Quick ratio is also called your acid test ratio, okay, or your liquid ratio. The formula to calculate this would be quick assets over current liabilities. Do you know what is quick assets?
Closing assets minus inventory.
Is your current
And
assets.
current asset,
Whatever
not
your
closing.
current assets are there, from that you
Yeah.
will minus your inventory. So this ratio is going to tell you the very short term solvency position of your company. Quick assets over current liability. Quick assets is current assets minus inventory over current liability. Your ideal quick ratio would be 1 is to 1. Okay.
Yeah.
Your next ratio is debt to equity ratio. Debt. Debt means your loans. Okay. Loans means your liabilities. And when I'm talking about equity, equity means your own funds. When I say this means your own funds, that means it means your shareholders' funds. Are you with me?
Yes. Yes,
Okay.
sir.
So when I'm talking about debt to equity, in your numerator, the word that comes first would be in your numerator. The word that comes last would be in your denominator. So you will have debt, you will have divided by equity. Okay. So debt to equity ratio, what does it compare? It compares your total debt to your equity. When I say your total debt is compared to your equity, that means in your company, do you have more of debts or do you have more of equity? It will show you this. Okay. If you have a higher debt to equity ratio, that means your loan is more and your own funds is less. A high ratio, the numerator is more. That means your loans are more and your own fund is less. When I'm talking about debt, what does debt mean? Debt
Long-term borrowings.
to equity. So your debt means
Uh,
your long-term borrowings. What does your equity mean? Equity means your shareholders' funds. Okay? Shareholders' funds, that means capital plus reserves. If the debt to
yes.
equity ratio is high, what does this mean? If the debt to equity ratio is high, that means your loan is more.
Okay.
Okay? That means you are at
Yeah.
more risk. You are running your company with other people's money. Next is your proprietary ratio. Proprietary ratio, that is your equity to asset indicator. Okay? Equity to asset indicator, that means it measures what is your equity. What is your shareholders funds when you compare to your total assets? Your total assets, that means your non-current assets plus your current assets, your total assets. How much of your total assets is being funded by your own funds? So your total assets which the company has, the wealth which the company has, how much of it is funded by your own money? And how much of the total assets is bought by other people's money? So here when I'm talking about proprietary ratio, the proprietor has bought the total assets from his own money. So how much of the total assets has been bought from his own money? Okay. If a
Yes.
more amount of total assets is bought from your own money, what does this mean? If more of the total assets is bought from your own money, that means you are independent. Let's take it with one example. Your own house. If your own house is brought out of your own money, is it good or a bad thing?
Good.
It's good. So that means if your assets is funded by your equity, if more of your assets, if more of your assets is funded by your equity, that means it is good financial independence and low relying on the external funds. Okay. A
Yeah.
proprietary ratio formula is equity over total assets. Why I am explaining you the formula? Because the formula comes with the explanation. What does the proprietary ratio tell you?
Yes.
How much of your total assets
Yeah.
is funded by equity?
Yeah.
Hmm? So, how much of your total assets is funded by equity? So, equity over total assets.
Equity over total assets.
How do you get your total assets?
How do we get our total assets?
Non-current assets plus your current
Yeah.
assets plus your investments will give you your total assets.
Total assets.
Hmm?
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
Okay. The next ratio is debt to total asset. Can you give me the formula of debt to total asset? What is
This it would be
first would come on the top?
debt.
Hmm.
Yeah. That's what.
What is
So
later
debt
would,
divided by total asset
how do you
comes
get
at the
the
bottom.
debt? What
How do
is
we
debt?
get debt? This is long-term borrowings.
Long term borrowings. How do you get total assets?
Total assets. It's the total assets of a.
How do you get total assets?
Wait.
Total assets means your non current assets plus your
Oh yeah.
current assets plus your investments. Okay.
Yeah. Not
So, what does this ratio tell you? Debt to total asset. This ratio tells you how much of your total asset is financed by debt.
debt.
Okay. If you have a higher percentage of this, that means you're relying more on outsiders' money to get your total assets.
Yeah.
Are you with me?
Yes.
So
Yes.
there is two ratio. One is proprietary ratio. Okay. One is proprietary ratio and one is debt to total assets ratio. What does the
Yes.
proprietary ratio tell you? Proprietary ratio will
It's
tell you how much of your
basically
total asset is funded by equity.
total assets,
How much of
equity.
your total asset is funded by equity? And debt to total asset ratio will tell you how much of your total assets is funded by debts.
Yes.
Okay. Proprietary ratio formula would be what?
The
Equity
same
over
equity over
total
total
asset.
asset.
Okay, debt to total equity
Yeah.
formula is what?
The debt over total asset.
Debt over total assets. The proprietary ratio will tell you how much of your total assets is funded by equity. Your debt to total asset ratio will tell you what? How much of your total asset
Debt to
is
total
funded
asset will
by
tell us.
your debt.
Debt.
Proprietary
Yeah.
ratio will tell you how much of your total assets is funded by equity.
By the equity.
Debt to total asset will tell you how much of your total asset is funded by your debt. Okay?
Yeah.
If you have a higher amount of proprietary ratio means what? If you have a good amount of total proprietary ratio, that means a higher percentage of your total assets is funded by your equity. A higher amount of your total assets is bought by your own money. A
Money.
higher amount of total assets is your own money. Good amount of financial independence, less risk.
No.
Okay? If your debt to total asset ratio is more, means what?
That means the
Higher amount of total
higher
assets
amount total asset.
stands by debt.
Debt.
Higher amount of total assets is taken by other people's money.
Okay. Yeah.
Higher amount of total asset is purchased by using loans.
Loans. Yeah.
That means it's a very great financial risk if there is some downturn.
Yeah.
Okay. So we did five ratios up till now. What is the five ratios we did up till now?
This current ratio, quick
One to five
ratio.
ratios we did. We did the
Yeah.
current ratio. Formula for this is,
Current asset divided by current liabilities.
we did quick ratio. Formula for this is.
Quick asset divided by current liabilities.
Then we did the third ratio.
Debt to equity. Debt
What does
divided by.
this mean?
It means that the uh,
In your total
from the
asset, what is the proportion of your debt and what is your proportion of your equity? Okay.
equity.
Debt to equity ratio. It compares your total debt to shareholders' funds. Okay, it compares your total debt to shareholders funds. That means, is your own fund more or is your loan fund more? What does it compare?
On or the thing loan fund.
Total debt to shareholders funds. It compares total
Yeah.
debt to shareholders funds. That means it tells you whether own funds is more or
Yeah.
loan funds is more.
Loan funds is more.
What is better?
I
What
think
should be
own funds.
better?
Yeah.
Own fund being more is better. So if you have a high debt to equity ratio, if you see in the numerator, you will have debt.
Yeah.
In the denominator, you will have equity.
Equity.
So if you have a high ratio, that means it is going to talk about your numerator.
Yeah.
So if you have a high ratio, it means it is going to talk about your numerator. It means it is going to talk about your debt.
Debt. Yeah.
It's going to talk about your numerator. It is going to talk about your debt. It is going to talk about your loan.
Loan.
That means your loan is more and equity is less.
Right. Yeah.
So we did current ratio, quick ratio, debt to equity. What is the next ratio?
Proprietary ratio.
Proprietary ratio, and what is the next one?
Debt to total asset.
Debt to total asset. Okay. What does your proprietary ratio tell you?
That equity over total assets is a
Equity over total assets. And debt to total assets, what does it tell you?
This thing, debt divided by total asset.
Okay. Now, what does this mean?
That the total assets is owned
How much
by,
of your total
yeah,
assets, how much of
how
your
much
total
of your
assets is
total
funded by
assets,
equity?
equity.
And here
How much of your total asset is owned by debt,
is funded by debt.
funded by debt. Yeah.
How much of total assets is funded by equity? And
How
this
much
will
of the
tell you
total,
how much of your total
how much of
assets.
the total assets is funded by debt?
Okay. If this is high, means what?
That the total asset,
It means more total assets is funded by equity.
yeah, uh,
That means you bought your total assets from your own money. More amount of it.
yes,
Good financial independence. Yeah?
mm,
Okay.
yeah,
Next one.
debt to
This
total,
is more.
yeah.
It
Well,
means
more total asset is funded by debt.
that means what? More total assets is
Total
funded by
asset is
debt,
funded by
but
debt.
depending on other people's money more, there is a greater financial risk during downturn.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
so these are your first five formulas. I want you to write this down. Try to just recall it properly and then I'll go ahead.